The first thing Miss Marple noticed was not the seal, nor the classification mark stamped in faded red ink, but the smell. Old paper had a way of carrying time within it. Dust, tobacco, and a faint metallic tang that reminded her of cold drawers and locked rooms. This file smelled of haste and regret. It had been slid beneath her cottage door sometime before dawn, placed carefully so as not to wake her, yet urgently enough to suggest fear. No name adorned the cover, only a handwritten phrase, neat but trembling. For your eyes only, because truth has nowhere else to go. She did not open it at once. Miss Marple never did. She set the kettle on, warmed her hands around a porcelain cup, and allowed the morning to settle. Outside, the village lay quiet beneath a thin veil of fog. Somewhere, a sparrow argued with the cold. People believed mysteries announced themselves loudly, with sirens and shouts. In Miss Marple's experience, the most dangerous ones arrived softly, like this file, asking for nothing but attention. A single sheet lay on top of the folder, a letter written in careful, formal English, as if the author feared emotion might betray him. Miss Marple, you do not know me, but you understand people. That is why I am writing. The man who vanished was supposed to be invisible. Instead, he has become unbearable to remember. Miss Marple's eyes paused there. Unbearable to remember, an odd phrase. People forgot what frightened them. They remembered what troubled their conscience. The letter explained little else. Only that during the height of the Cold War, a senior diplomat had disappeared from a neutral European city. No witnesses. No ransom. No official explanation. The case had been sealed, buried beneath layers of political convenience. And yet, decades later, someone wanted it understood. Miss Marple closed the folder gently. She already knew why it had come to her.
Gouvernement soft silence, institution soft deniability.
But guilt sought resolution. When she finally opened the file, she found photographs first. A man in his late 40s, neatly dressed, his expression composed but not warm. His eyes held the distance of someone trained to listen more than he spoke. The caption read simply, Ambassador Elias Verhoeven. Miss Marple tilted her head. You look, she murmured, like a man who learned too early that safety lies in restraint. The report that followed was methodical to the point of sterility. Date of disappearance. Last confirmed location. A modest cafe near a tram stop. Weather conditions. Overcast. Political context. Heightened tensions. Reciprocal accusations. Unspoken threats. It all read as though written by someone determined not to think too deeply. But what interested Miss Marple was what was not included. There was no mention of Verhoeven's habits. No description of his temperament. No attempt to understand why a man so practiced in caution might suddenly vanish without a trace. People don't disappear, she said softly. They are pushed, or they step away. She rose and walked to the window, watching the fog thin as the day gathered courage. During the Cold War, fear had been a currency more valuable than gold. Passed quietly between hands, altered decisions, ruined friendships. Miss Marple had watched it work its way through small villages and grand drawing rooms alike. The scale changed, the people did not. Returning to her chair, she examined a small personal inventory found among Verhoeven's effects. A wristwatch, stopped at precisely 11:47. A matchbox from the cafe. A folded train timetable, creased and smoothed again, as though handled repeatedly. To others, these were meaningless objects. To Miss Marple, they were gestures, unconscious confessions of routine and intention. She smiled faintly. You were waiting, she said to the absent diplomat, but not for what they thought. The next pages detailed interviews conducted after the disappearance. Embassy staff spoke in polished phrases. Security officers reported nothing unusual. A waitress recalled him paying carefully, leaving a proper tip, and apologizing for the cold. No one remembered his expression clearly. That, Miss Marple thought, was telling. People remembered faces that asked something of them. Verhoeven had asked for nothing at all. One statement caught her attention. A guard who mentioned seeing the ambassador check his watch twice within a minute. An insignificant detail, dismissed in the margin. Miss Marple underlined it with her pencil. Anxious men, she murmured, pretend not to be, but time always betrays them. She leaned back, letting the silence of the room envelop her. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, unbothered by history. Somewhere, far away in memory, trains crossed borders that no longer existed, carrying secrets wrapped in ordinary coats. By the time the kettle boiled again, Miss Marple had reached a conclusion, not an answer but a direction. This was not a case of sudden violence. There was no chaos in the evidence, no rupture. Everything about Verhoeven's disappearance spoke of deliberation, care. A plan shaped by long reflection and quiet fear. The final page of the file was blank, save for a single sentence typed at the bottom. Official conclusion. Subject presumed deceased. Case closed. Miss Marple closed the folder and placed her hand atop it, as one might rest a palm on a sleeping child. No, she said gently. Cases like this are never closed. They merely wait. Outside, the fog had lifted entirely. The village returned to itself, unaware that a ghost from a divided world had just entered a small cottage. Miss Marple poured her tea, already thinking of cafes near borders, of watches that stopped too precisely, and of the peculiar courage it took, not to spy, not to fight, but simply to vanish. The Cold War, she knew, was not fought only between nations. It was fought within hearts. And this man's heart, wherever it had gone, was still speaking. Chapter 2. A Diplomat Without Shadows. Miss Marple had always believed that truly dangerous people were not those who attracted attention, but those who avoided it so completely that one forgot to look for them at all. Ambassador Elias Verhoeven belonged unmistakably to that second category. As she read deeper into the file, his life unfolded not as a series of events, but as a pattern of careful absences. He had been born in a small coastal town, the kind that taught children early how to listen to the weather and keep their voices low. His academic record was exemplary, yet unremarkable in its ambition. He never topped his class, never failed either. He learned languages not with enthusiasm, but with patience. By the time he entered diplomatic service, he had mastered the art of being agreeable without being memorable. Miss Marple paused, folding her hands. You learned, she said softly, that survival often belongs to the quiet. The official biography described him as steady, reliable, and discreet, praise that, in the world of diplomacy, often meant invisible. During postings in divided cities and uneasy capitals, Verhoeven was known for listening longer than he spoke, for declining social invitations with gentle excuses, for keeping his opinions measured and his papers in perfect order. He did not drink excessively. He did not gamble. He did not keep a mistress. There were no scandals attached to his name. And yet, Miss Marple thought, people like this did not vanish without reason. They endured. She turned to a personal letter included in the file, written by a former colleague years before the disappearance. It described Verhoeven as unsettlingly calm, particularly during crises. When accusations flew and tempers rose, he alone seemed untouched by panic. Not brave exactly, but distant, as though part of him remained elsewhere, observing rather than participating. That, Miss Marple murmured, is not calmness. That is preparation. She imagined him walking through embassy corridors late at night, the lights dimmed, his footsteps absorbed by thick carpets. Men like Verhoeven learned early that walls had ears, that silence could be more loyal than people. In the Cold War, friendships were provisional and trust expired quickly. To endure was to reduce oneself, to become small enough to slip between the machinery of power. Yet there were small fractures in this smooth surface. One report mentioned that Verhoeven had refused a promotion that would have placed him closer to intelligence operations. Another noted his reluctance to carry a personal security detail, citing a preference for ordinary routines. Miss Marple smiled faintly at that. Ordinary routines, she said, are often the most carefully rehearsed. The file included an interview with Verhoeven's wife, Anna, conducted several weeks after the disappearance. Miss Marple read it slowly, sensing the tension behind the formal language. Anna described her husband as kind, distant, and unfailingly polite. He never raised his voice. He never spoke of his work at home. Their evenings followed a predictable rhythm. Dinner at 7, a short walk, reading by lamplight. But there was a moment, recorded almost as an afterthought, that made Miss Marple stop. Anna mentioned that in the months before he vanished, Elias had begun setting his watch 5 minutes fast. 5 minutes, Miss Marple whispered. Not early enough to be noticed, only enough to feel. She closed her eyes briefly. People adjusted time when they needed control. When the world pressed too closely, they created small private advantages, tiny cushions against panic. Another document described a dinner hosted at the embassy 2 nights before Verhoeven disappeared. Guests recalled him being attentive, courteous, unremarkable. Yet one guest noted that Verhoeven seemed oddly focused on the windows, as if measuring the light beyond them. A ridiculous detail, the interviewer had written. Miss Marple underlined it. People look at windows, she said, when they are thinking about leaving. She leaned back in her chair, the afternoon light slanting softly across the room. Verhoeven was not a man with enemies in the usual sense. He had no dramatic rivalries, no loud conflicts. His danger lay elsewhere, in what he knew and in what he feared becoming complicit in. During the Cold War, diplomats often served as polite curtains behind which harsher truths were exchanged. Miss Marple suspected Verhoeven had seen something that did not align with the careful moral geometry he had constructed for himself. And unlike others, he had not found a way to ignore it. Late in the chapter of his life that ended in disappearance, Miss Marple detected a subtle shift. Verhoeven began declining public engagements. He took solitary walks. He requested older files from the archives, records unrelated to his current posting. These were small acts of deviation, almost invisible against the backdrop of routine. Yet to Miss Marple they formed a clear trajectory. He was gathering himself, she said quietly. Not evidence, resolve. The final personal item listed before his disappearance was the train timetable. It covered multiple border crossings, several marked faintly in pencil. The report dismissed it as a habit of a frequent traveler. Miss Marple shook her head. No, she murmured. You were planning where to stop being who you were. As evening settled, Miss Marple closed the file and sat in thoughtful silence. Elias Verhoeven had lived his life as a man without shadows, so carefully neutral that no one could quite define him. And yet, in the end, that very absence had become his burden. To belong everywhere was to belong nowhere. Disappearance, she reflected, was sometimes not an escape, but a form of confession. A way of saying I can no longer pretend this is enough. She rose to light a lamp, the warm glow pushing back the gathering dusk. Tomorrow she would examine the place he was last seen. Cafés remembered things that people did not, hesitations, glances, the unspoken weight of decisions. For now, she allowed herself one final thought. Verhoeven had not vanished because he was weak. He had vanished because he was human. And in a world divided by fear, humanity was often the most dangerous secret of all. Chapter 3. The Cafe Near the Border. Miss Marple arrived in the city on a quiet morning when the air still carried the memory of night. Fog clung to the streets like a deliberate omission, softening edges and muting color. It was the kind of place where borders were felt more than seen, where languages overlapped in shop windows and people learned to keep their opinions folded neatly inside their coats. She had chosen to begin where Elias Verhoeven had last been seen alive. A modest cafe near a tram stop, ordinary enough to escape notice, significant enough to remember those who came with intention. The cafe stood on a narrow street, its windows slightly clouded, its sign faded but carefully maintained. Miss Marple paused before entering, noting the rhythm of passers-by, the way some glanced instinctively over their shoulders while others walked with practiced indifference. In cities like this, fear had taught people how to appear calm. Inside, the cafe was warm and quietly alive. A few early patrons sat scattered at small tables, their cups cradled in both hands as if warmth were something to be earned. The air smelled of coffee and old wood, a comforting scent layered with years of waiting conversations. Miss Marple chose a table near the window, the same one, according to the file, where Verhoeven had sat. She did not order immediately. Instead, she allowed herself to become part of the room. Cafes revealed themselves slowly, she believed. They spoke in gestures rather than words. From this seat, she could see the tram stop across the street. People arrived and departed with the gentle urgency of routine. Miss Marple imagined Verhoeven here, coat neatly buttoned, hat resting beside him, his posture composed yet attentive. A man preparing to leave did not fidget. He watched. The waitress approached at last, older now than she had been at the time of the disappearance. Her movements economical, her eyes observant. Miss Marple ordered tea and, when it arrived, thanked her with the kind of warmth that invited conversation without demanding it. "I'm told this table has seen many stories," Miss Marple said softly, touching the worn wood. The woman smiled faintly. "All tables do," she replied. "People talk when they think no one is listening." "Do you remember a gentleman who sat here often?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. "Very polite, very quiet." The waitress nodded slowly. "Yes, the diplomat. He came alone. Always alone." She recalled the details without strain. The careful way he folded his coat, the precise manner in which he stirred his coffee. He had asked the time once, though there had been a clock on the wall. Miss Marple's eyes lifted to it now, ticked steadily, indifferent to memory. "He checked his watch twice," the waitress continued. "And then he waited, not impatient, just still." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Waiting can be exhausting," she said. "Yes," the woman agreed. It looked like relief when he finished his drink. Relief. Miss Marple noted the word carefully. People who felt relief at the end of something had already decided how it would conclude. The tram arrived as if summoned by memory, its bell a soft chime against the air. Miss Marple watched passengers board, some glancing back toward the cafe, others fixed on the doors ahead. Verhoeven had not boarded that tram, the file said. He had stood, paid, apologized for the cold, and stepped outside. "Did he leave in a hurry?" Miss Marple asked. "No," the waitress said. "He walked, slowly, like someone who did not wish to arrive too soon." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. There were moments, she knew, when time felt heavier than distance, when every step carried the weight of consequence. After the waitress returned to her work, Miss Marple remained seated, her tea cooling unnoticed. She allowed the cafe to speak to her. The scrape of chairs, the murmur of voices, the pauses between words. In those pauses, she sensed the echo of a man deciding whether to cross more than a street. The file mentioned a matchbox found on the table, branded with the cafe's name. Miss Marple turned it over in her hands now, examining the worn edges. Matches were small things easily overlooked, yet they suggested anticipation. One carried matches when one expected darkness. Outside, the fog thinned, revealing the street in sharper relief. Miss Marple paid her bill and stepped out, the cold brushing her cheeks with sudden clarity. She followed the route Verhoeven had taken, as reconstructed by the report. Past the tram stop, down a side street where posters peeled from brick walls, along a canal where the water moved with deceptive calm. Miss Marple walked slowly, attentive to sensation rather than direction. People hurried past her, absorbed in their own necessities. At the canal, she paused. The water reflected the sky imperfectly, broken by gentle ripples. Miss Marple imagined Verhoeven standing here, watching his own reflection fragment. Men who lived divided lives often recognized themselves only in distortion. "Did you hesitate?" she asked the empty air. "Or had you already made peace?" A bench nearby bore the scars of time, initials carved, paint chipped. Miss Marple sat and listened. Trains passed in the distance, their sound carrying the promise of elsewhere. The timetable folded in Verhoeven's pocket must have felt heavier with each step, a reminder of choices narrowing into inevitability. The report concluded that Verhoeven had simply vanished at this point. No witnesses beyond this stretch, no evidence of struggle. Miss Marple believed that. There was no violence here, only the quiet bravery of someone stepping beyond the boundaries that had defined him. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. The cafe had not been the scene of an end, but of a beginning. Verhoeven had come there not to hide, but to gather courage among ordinary people, in a place where no one asked questions. The Cold War thrived on secrets and spectacles. But this man had chosen something smaller and far more dangerous, an ordinary exit unnoticed. And in that choice, Miss Marple sensed the true mystery waiting ahead. Not how he disappeared, but why he believed vanishing was the only honest thing left to do. Chapter 4. Embassy lies are polite lies. The embassy building stood apart from the city, not by distance but by demeanor. Its walls were immaculate, its windows reflective enough to return the sky without revealing anything within. Miss Marple paused at the gate, noting how silence behaved differently here. Less organic, more rehearsed. Places of power, she had learned, did not echo. They absorbed. Inside, the air was cooler, scented faintly with polish and paper. Footsteps sounded careful, moderated by carpets chosen for their discretion. Miss Marple was received with courtesy that bordered on choreography. Names were exchanged, hands shaken, smiles offered with professional precision. No one asked why she had come. They already knew. In places like this, curiosity was considered impolite. Ambassador Verhoeven was greatly respected, one official said, guiding her down a corridor lined with portraits. His disappearance was a tragedy. Miss Marple nodded. Tragedies, she replied softly, often require witnesses. They led her to a conference room where documents had been prepared in tidy stacks. Reports, statements, timelines. Each page was immaculate, free of hesitation or doubt. Miss Marple took her time, allowing the officials to settle into their seats. People revealed themselves, she knew, not when they spoke, but when they waited. The first report described Verhoeven's final days in language so balanced it felt weightless. No conflicts, no concerns, no deviations from routine. Miss Marple read it twice, then looked up. "He must have been a very easy man to work with," she said. A pause. "Just long enough." "Yes," the official replied. "Very." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Easy people, she thought, were often the most difficult to understand. She turned to a security log. Names, times, signatures. Everything aligned neatly except for a small gap. A missing notation during the hour Verhoeven left the embassy for the last time. The omission had been explained away as clerical error. "Errors," Miss Marple said, tracing the blank space with her finger, "are rarely random." The security chief shifted in his chair. "We've reviewed this extensively." "I'm sure," Miss Marple replied gently. "But reviews tend to confirm what one already wishes to believe." She asked about Verhoeven's demeanor in the weeks before his disappearance. The answers came smoothly. Calm, professional, unchanged. Too unchanged, Miss Marple thought. Human beings altered subtly under pressure. Absolute consistency was a performance. As the meeting continued, Miss Marple observed the rhythm of responses. When asked factual questions, answers arrived promptly. When she inquired about feelings, tension, unease, private concerns, the room cooled. Eyes dropped briefly to papers. Throats were cleared. "Ambassador Verhoeven did not confide in staff," one official said. "He was reserved." "Reserved people," Miss Marple replied, "often say more by what they avoid." She noticed then a young clerk seated near the door, silent throughout, his hands folded too tightly. He had not spoken once, yet his attention had never wavered. Miss Marple made a note of him, not on paper, but in the quiet catalogue of her mind. The final interview was with the ambassador's immediate superior, a man whose voice carried the assurance of authority long practiced. He spoke of geopolitical pressures, of delicate balances, of the necessity of discretion. "In times like those," he said, "personal considerations must yield to stability." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And when stability requires silence?" The man met her gaze steadily. "Then silence is a duty." Miss Marple accepted the answer with a nod, though her eyes softened. Duty, she reflected, was often the language used to excuse fear. The Cold War had taught people to mistake obedience for virtue. Before leaving, she asked to see Verhoeven's office. The room was preserved as it had been. Desk orderly, books aligned, a single framed photograph turned face down in a drawer. Miss Marple lifted it carefully. It showed a coastline at dusk, waves gentle, horizon wide. "A place to breathe," she murmured. Alone for a moment, Miss Marple stood in the office and listened. Offices remembered things. They held the residue of late nights, of decisions weighed and postponed. She ran her fingers along the desk's edge, noting faint impressions where hands had rested repeatedly. Here Verhoeven had waited. Here he had decided what he could no longer carry. Miss Marple replaced the photograph and closed the drawer. When she turned back toward the corridor, she found the young clerk standing there, pale but determined. "I shouldn't speak to you," he said quietly. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You already have." They spoke briefly, carefully. The clerk did not offer revelations, only impressions. Verhoeven had seemed tired, thoughtful. He had asked once about archived files unrelated to his post. He had thanked the clerk, thanked him for efficiency, as though concluding something. "That was the last time?" Miss Marple asked. The clerk nodded. "Yes." Miss Marple touched his arm lightly. "Thank you," she said. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the embassy steps. Miss Marple paused before descending, looking back at the building. Embassies, she thought, were places where truth was negotiated until it resembled politeness. She had found no overt lies inside, only omissions, adjustments, and carefully chosen silences. But those were lies enough. The Cold War thrived on them. As she walked away, Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. Verhoeven had not been lost to chaos or violence. He had been lost to a system that required him to stop being human. And rather than surrender that final piece of himself, he had chosen disappearance. The embassy would never admit that.
Institution rarely confessed.
But people did, through hesitation, through glances, through the things they were taught never to say aloud. And Miss Marple was listening. Chapter 5. A watch that stopped at 11:47. Miss Marple returned to her hotel room as evening drew its careful curtains across the city. The light outside faded into a thoughtful blue, the kind that softened outlines and invited reflection. She placed the file on the small writing desk and, from within it, removed the object that had occupied her thoughts since the beginning. Elias Verhoeven's wristwatch. It was an ordinary thing. Leather strap worn smooth by habit, glass uncracked, hands frozen at precisely 11:47. No report had questioned the time. No analyst had wondered why it mattered. Yet to Miss Marple, time was never neutral. People measured it, bent it, resisted it, especially when they were afraid. She held the watch gently, as though it might still feel something. She recalled the waitress's words, the clerk's hesitation, the way Verhoeven had checked his watch twice within a minute. Time, Miss Marple knew, became oppressive when a decision had already been made. One did not look forward but inward, counting the seconds one still belonged to the old self. At 11:47, according to the reconstruction, Verhoeven had left the cafe. The tram had arrived shortly afterward. The gap between those moments was small, almost dismissible. But small gaps were where lives changed. Why stop then? Miss Marple murmured. Why not later or earlier? She closed her eyes and imagined him standing in the cold, watch ticking against his pulse. Perhaps that was the moment he realized he would not return. Perhaps he stopped time himself, not mechanically but deliberately by stepping beyond it. The next morning, Miss Marple visited a modest watchmaker tucked into a narrow side street. The shop smelled of oil and patience. Clocks of all sizes lined the walls, each ticking in its own quiet insistence. The watchmaker examined Verhoeven's watch with reverent care. It was not broken, he said finally. It was stopped. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Intentionally? Yes, he replied. The crown was pulled at exactly this time. Whoever wore it wanted it to stop. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as one might close a door. The watchmaker smiled faintly, as though he understood. People bring me watches after deaths, he said. This one does not feel like that. It feels like a goodbye. Back outside, the city moved around her, indifferent to the revelation. Miss Marple walked slowly, letting the implication settle. Verhoeven had not lost track of time. He had chosen to abandon it. In doing so, he had left a marker, not for others but for himself. She thought of Anna, setting her watch 5 minutes fast. Of Verhoeven stopping his entirely. Marriage, she reflected, was often a quiet negotiation with time. Two people adjusting their clocks without speaking of it. Miss Marple returned to the canal, the water reflecting a sky now heavy with cloud. She sat where she had sat before, the watch resting in her gloved palm. 11:47, she whispered. Not noon, not an hour, just before something ended, or began. As she watched the water move, Miss Marple considered the emotional weight of that moment. Verhoeven had lived his life precisely, carefully. He had measured words, steps, loyalties. To stop his watch was to reject measurement altogether, to say this is as far as I go. People often believed courage was loud. They imagined defiance as confrontation. But Miss Marple knew another kind, quiet, inward, resolute. The kind that required no witnesses. She imagined Verhoeven removing the watch, feeling the cold air against his wrist, lighter without it. Perhaps he had left it behind deliberately, knowing someone might one day understand. You trusted, she said softly, that someone would listen. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a single note in her journal. Time is not evidence. It is confession. The watch had not been an accident. It had been a boundary. Whatever waited beyond 11:47, Verhoeven had chosen it with clarity and finality. As the city lights flickered on, Miss Marple felt the case narrowing. Not toward violence or conspiracy, but toward something more intimate. A man had stepped out of his assigned life. The world had noticed only his absence, not his intention. She closed the file gently. Tomorrow she would speak to Anna. Time had spoken enough. Now it was emotion's turn. And somewhere, in a life that no longer answered to clocks, Elias Verhoeven was still moving forward. Unmeasured, unseen, but not lost. Chapter 6. The Woman Who Waited. Anna Verhoeven lived in a quiet apartment overlooking a small square where children no longer played. The benches were empty, the trees neatly trimmed, as if the space had been designed for observation rather than joy. Miss Marple arrived in the late afternoon, when light softened the sharpness of memory and made difficult conversations more bearable. Anna opened the door herself. She was composed, carefully so, her posture straight, her hair pinned with deliberate neatness. Yet her eyes carried the unmistakable stillness of someone who had been waiting a very long time. You have come about Elias, she said, not as a question. Yes, Miss Marple replied gently. If you are willing. Anna stepped aside. I have been willing for years. The apartment was orderly but not sterile. Books lined the walls. A teacup rested on a coaster, untouched. Miss Marple noted how everything seemed paused, not abandoned, as though life had learned to hold its breath. They sat opposite each other near the window. Outside, the square lay quiet, shadows stretching across stone. Anna poured tea with steady hands. Everyone asked the wrong questions, Anna said calmly. They wanted to know who took him. No one asked why he might have gone. Miss Marple nodded. People often prefer mysteries that absolve them. Anna's lips curved faintly, without humor. Elias believed silence was a kind of protection. For others. For himself. She spoke not with bitterness, but with understanding. An understanding shaped by long companionship. Anna described their life together. The predictability, the careful avoidance of danger. Elias never spoke of politics at home. He never complained. He listened. In the evenings, they walked the same route, watched the same patch of sky darken above the rooftops. But something changed, Anna said softly. Not suddenly. Gradually. Miss Marple waited. Silence, she knew, encouraged truth. He began to look tired before the day even started, Anna continued. Not physically. Tired of holding something in. She paused, fingers tightening around her cup. He once asked me whether it was possible to live honestly without telling the truth. Miss Marple met her gaze. And what did you say? That honesty is sometimes not about words, Anna replied, but about refusing to become something you despise. Anna rose and crossed the room, opening a drawer with measured care. From it, she removed a small notebook, its cover worn smooth. He did not write often, she said, but near the end, he wrote this. Miss Marple accepted it carefully. Inside were not secrets or plans, but observations. descriptions of light, of trains passing at night, of the feeling of being watched even when alone. One line stood out, underlined twice. If I stay, I will belong to this lie forever. Miss Marple closed the notebook slowly. He was afraid, she said. But not of leaving. Anna nodded. He was afraid of remaining. They spoke then of the watch, of the habit of setting it fast. Anna smiled faintly at that. I set mine fast, she said. He stopped his. The difference hung between them, heavy with meaning. Anna had chosen to cope within time. Elias had chosen to step beyond it. Did he say goodbye? Miss Marple asked quietly. Anna shook her head. No. But the night before he disappeared, he thanked me for my patience. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Gratitude, she knew, often replaced farewell when words were too final. As evening deepened, Anna lit a lamp. The room filled with warm, restrained light. I do not believe he is dead, Anna said suddenly. Not because I hope, but because he was careful. And because he was tired of being careful only for others. Miss Marple smiled gently. Then you understand him better than anyone. Anna looked toward the window. Understanding does not lessen the waiting. No, Miss Marple agreed. But it gives it dignity. She rose to leave, sensing the conversation had reached its natural end. At the door, Anna spoke once more. If you find him, she said, do not bring him back. Miss Marple met her eyes. I will not, she said softly. Outside, the square lay in twilight. Miss Marple walked slowly, the weight of the meeting settling into clarity. This was not a case of loss inflicted. It was a departure chosen, shaped by love and restraint. Elias Verhoeven had not disappeared from fear alone. He had disappeared to preserve something fragile and essential within himself. And Anna had been the one who waited, not because she was weak, but because she understood that some truths could only survive in absence. With that understanding, Miss Marple felt the case move closer to its quiet center. 6 chapters in, and the mystery was no longer about where the diplomat had gone, but about whether the world had ever deserved him at all. Chapter 7: Intelligence Reports versus Human Nature. The archive building lay beneath the city like a memory no one wished to revisit. Miss Marple descended its narrow steps slowly, her hand resting lightly on the rail, aware of the quiet pressing in from all sides. This was where facts were stored without feeling, where events were reduced to categories and codes. And yet, she knew truth rarely survived such compression. The room assigned to her was dim and carefully organized. Rows of folders sat in silent judgment, each labeled with dates and destinations. Cold War intelligence preserved like specimens, studied, classified, and often misunderstood. Miss Marple took a seat at a long table, the weight of the files before her suggesting certainty where none truly existed. They believe, she murmured, that information explains people. The first reports detailed surveillance of Elias Verhoeven over several years. Movements tracked, conversations summarized, contacts listed. There was no shortage of data. Yet reading through it, Miss Marple felt a growing sense of absence. Verhoeven was described as consistent, predictable, and low risk. His behavior followed expected patterns. He attended meetings, returned home, took evening walks. Intelligence officers had concluded that his stability rendered him harmless. Miss Marple paused, fingers resting on the page. Harmless? She repeated softly. Or simply quiet? She noticed how the reports emphasized what Verhoeven did, but never why. They measured frequency, not meaning. In doing so, they had mistaken repetition for loyalty. Another file outlined hypothetical scenarios following his disappearance. defection, abduction, elimination. Each theory was presented with supporting logic, probabilities assigned like weather forecasts. Yet none addressed the simplest possibility, that Verhoeven had chosen to leave not for ideology, but for integrity. Miss Marple leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. Intelligence agencies, she reflected, were trained to interpret actions as strategies. They struggled with motives that did not fit political frameworks. Conscience did not translate well into charts. One note caught her attention. A dismissed analyst's comment scribbled in the margin years earlier. Subject displays signs of moral fatigue. The phrase had been underlined once, then crossed out. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Moral fatigue was not an operational term. It was a human one. People grew tired not only of danger, but of compromise. The Cold War demanded endless accommodation with half-truths. Verhoeven, she suspected, had reached the point where accommodation felt like betrayal. She imagined him reading similar reports about others, seeing lives reduced to variables. Perhaps, in recognizing himself in those pages, he had realized how little of him truly belonged there. Human nature, Miss Marple said softly, does not follow orders. The final report attempted to reconstruct Verhoeven's psychology. It concluded that he lacked the temperament for spontaneous action, citing his lifelong caution. Therefore, disappearance was deemed unlikely without external force. Miss Marple closed the file with care. They confuse caution with passivity, she thought. Cautious people are often the ones who plan most carefully. She gathered her notes and rose. The archive offered no answers, only confirmation of its own blindness. Institutions studied behavior, but they did not listen. They assumed fear would always outweigh principle. Outside, daylight greeted her with gentle insistence. Miss Marple breathed deeply, feeling the contrast between the stale certainty of the archive and the living ambiguity of the street. She walked without destination, letting the city's ordinary sounds guide her. Somewhere a clock chimed, somewhere else a train passed unseen. Life continued, indifferent to analysis. Miss Marple stopped near a small bridge overlooking the canal. The water moved steadily, untroubled by scrutiny. She leaned on the railing, thinking of Verhoeven reading reports like those she had just seen. Reports that misunderstood people because they refused to imagine inner lives. He knew, she said quietly, that they would never look for him where he truly was. Intelligence reports had failed not because they lacked information, but because they lacked empathy. They could predict betrayals driven by ambition, but not departures motivated by self-respect. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her room and wrote another note in her journal. They mistook stillness for obedience. The case had reached a turning point. 7 chapters in, and the pattern was unmistakable. Elias Verhoeven had not been underestimated. He had been misread. His silence had been interpreted as compliance, his restraint as weakness. Miss Marple closed her journal and gazed out at the city lights. Somewhere beyond those lights, a man lived free of reports and expectations, guided only by his own conscience. Tomorrow she would follow the trail intelligence had ignored, the silent routes, the unrecorded journeys. Because human nature, once misunderstood, often left its clearest traces where no one thought to look. And Miss Marple had always known where to find them. Chapter 8. The Silent Train. The train station breathed differently at dawn. Miss Marple noticed it at once. The way sound softened beneath the high iron roof. The way footsteps echoed with restraint, as if even noise understood the importance of discretion. Trains were honest things, she believed. They did not ask questions. They carried people away without judgment, indifferent to reasons. She stood on the platform with her coat drawn close, watching steam lift gently into the pale morning air. Elias Verhoeven had favored trains over cars, the file had noted. Less attention, he had once remarked to a colleague. Miss Marple understood. Trains offered anonymity through sameness. One face among many, one destination among countless possibilities. She purchased a ticket for the same route Verhoeven might have taken, one that crossed borders quietly, passing through towns that rarely appeared in reports. The clerk barely looked at her, his hand moving with practiced indifference. Miss Marple found that reassuring. Important journeys, she had learned, often went unnoticed. As the train pulled away, the city receded into a blur of rooftops and chimneys. Miss Marple settled into her seat, observing her fellow passengers with gentle curiosity. A man with a newspaper folded too carefully. A woman clutching a small suitcase as though it contained something fragile. Faces shaped by routine, by escape, by necessity. She imagined Verhoeven here, choosing a seat that allowed him to observe without being observed. He would have kept his coat on, she thought. People preparing to leave for good often resisted comfort. The countryside unfolded in muted colors. Fields washed in gray, villages still half asleep. Miss Marple let the rhythm of the train steady her thoughts. This, she felt, was where Verhoeven had truly disappeared. Not in a moment of drama, but in a long, unremarkable passage between places. At a small border stop, officials boarded briefly. Papers were checked, passports stamped. The process was efficient, almost careless. Miss Marple watched closely. There was no tension, no alarm. Borders, she reflected, were only intimidating when one feared being seen. Verhoeven would not have feared this moment. He had crossed borders his entire life. Only now he crossed as himself, not as a representative. The train continued, gathering quiet miles. Miss Marple closed her eyes, imagining the emotional weight Verhoeven must have carried. Relief certainly, but also grief. One did not abandon a life without mourning it. The notebook Anna had shared echoed in her mind. If I stay, I will belong to this lie forever. Belonging, she thought, was often more binding than chains. When the train slowed at a remote station, Miss Marple stepped onto the platform briefly. The place was small, almost forgotten. A single cafe. A narrow road disappearing into trees. No cameras. No officials lingering. This, she felt, was where someone might choose to become ordinary again. She did not believe Verhoeven had stayed here, but she believed he had paused, just long enough to breathe. Back on the train, Miss Marple noticed something else. The absence of urgency. No one hurried. No one watched the doors with anxiety. Trains offered a rare mercy, the permission to wait without explanation. She thought of the watch stopped at 11:47, of time relinquished, of a man stepping into movement that required no measurement. On this train, time was felt, not counted. Miss Marple's heart softened. For years, Verhoeven had lived inside schedules and protocols. Here, time dissolved into motion. The train asked nothing of him except to remain aboard. He chose wisely, she murmured. As evening approached, the train neared its final destination. Miss Marple did not disembark. She had learned what she needed. The silent train had confirmed her belief. Verhoeven had not fled in panic. He had departed with deliberation, trusting in the ordinary mercy of transit. She remained seated as passengers filed out, watching the doors close again. The train would continue, carrying new stories, new disappearances, new beginnings. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not all vanishing is loss, she said. Some is preservation. When she finally rose to leave, she felt the case settle into clarity. The path Verhoeven had taken was not marked by secrecy, but by humility. He had chosen to become small enough to survive. Outside, Night gathered gently. Miss Marple walked away from the station, her steps unhurried. The mystery had never been where the diplomat went. It was how the world failed to see him leave. And now, with the quiet certainty of someone who understood both trains and people, Miss Marple knew the ending was approaching, not with revelation, but with acceptance. Chapter 9. Why he chose to vanish. Miss Marple did not search for Elias Verhoeven anymore. Not in the way others would have understood searching. She no longer traced routes or examined documents. The path had narrowed inward, toward something far less visible and far more decisive, the moment a man chooses who he will become. She sat alone in her room that evening, the window slightly open, letting in the distant hum of the city. Lights flickered on and off across rooftops like cautious thoughts. This, she knew, was where the answer lived, not in geography, but in conscience. People do not vanish, she said softly. They resign. She thought back over everything she had learned. The watch stopped at 11:47. The cafe. The silent train. The intelligence reports that saw patterns but not people. And Anna waiting, understanding without demanding. Elias Verhoeven had lived for decades within carefully negotiated boundaries. His work required him to smooth over truths, to translate danger into politeness, to protect stability at the cost of clarity. At first, this had seemed noble, necessary. But necessity had a way of becoming habit, and habit, over time, became identity. Miss Marple closed her eyes. "You stayed too long," she murmured. He had not been afraid of dying. He had been afraid of continuing to live as someone he no longer recognized. In the Cold War, defection was loud. It came with announcements, accusations, and spectacle. Verhoeven had chosen something far more radical. Disappearance without narrative.
No eslogans. No confessions. No replacement loyalties.
By vanishing quietly, he refused to be claimed by any side. Miss Marple realized then that this was the truest form of resistance available to him. To leave without explanation was to deny everyone ownership of his reasons. Governments could not punish what they could not define. Intelligence agencies could not decode what was not performative. He had chosen ambiguity deliberately. She recalled the notebook Anna had shared, the small observations, the fragments of feeling. Verhoeven had written not like a man plotting escape, but like one slowly shedding weight. He noticed light. He noticed silence. He noticed how often he was being watched and how little he was seen. Miss Marple smiled sadly. "You were surrounded," she said, "yet invisible." The emotional toll of that invisibility was something no report had measured. To be trusted with secrets yet denied truth. To be respected yet never known. To speak endlessly on behalf of others, while remaining voiceless oneself. At some point, restraint ceased to be discipline and became erasure. Miss Marple rose and walked to the mirror, studying her own reflection. Age had softened her features, but her eyes remained clear. She had spent a lifetime watching people deny themselves for reasons they could no longer remember. "Integrity," she said quietly, "is not loud. It simply refuses to bend any further." Elias Verhoeven had reached that point. He had not left to start a new life filled with adventure or freedom. He had left to preserve a small, intact version of himself, one that still believed in meaning without justification. His disappearance was not escape. It was alignment. Late into the night, Miss Marple wrote her final note on the case. He vanished because staying required him to lie, not once but forever. She closed her notebook and felt a sense of calm. There would be no dramatic reveal.
No triumphant discovery.
The truth, such as it was, belonged only to those willing to accept it quietly. Somewhere, perhaps in a village that valued anonymity, Elias Verhoeven lived under a different name, or perhaps under no name that mattered. He would wake without dread. He would drink coffee without watching the door. He would exist without serving as a symbol. Miss Marple believed that was enough. As she extinguished the lamp, the room fell into gentle darkness. The Cold War had demanded many sacrifices, most of them invisible. Elias Verhoeven had simply chosen not to become one of them any longer. And that, Miss Marple knew, was the most human choice of all. Chapter 10. The Cold War never ends quietly. The morning Miss Marple prepared to leave the city, it rained. Not heavily, but with persistence, as though the sky itself had learned restraint. She stood by the window of her hotel room, watching droplets trace slow paths down the glass. Endings, she thought, rarely announced themselves. They simply continued differently. She packed with care, placing the file back into her bag. It felt lighter now, not because it contained less, but because it no longer demanded answers. The truth had settled into place, quiet and complete. Before departing, she had agreed to one final meeting, an informal conversation requested by an official who had maintained a courteous distance until now. It was not curiosity that prompted it, Miss Marple sensed, but unease. They met in a small cafe far from the embassy.
No flags, no formalities.
The man arrived precisely on time, his coat damp from the rain, his eyes alert. "You believe," he said without preamble, "that Ambassador Verhoeven chose to disappear?" Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "I believe he chose to remain himself." The man frowned. "That interpretation creates difficulties." "It always does," Miss Marple replied. "Truth tends to." He spoke of consequences, of precedent, of uncertainty. If such a conclusion were acknowledged, others might follow. Systems depended on predictability. "Systems," Miss Marple said softly, "are built by people. They should not require people to vanish inside them." The man said nothing. Silence, she knew, was often the final refuge of those who understood but could not agree. As she walked away from the cafe, Miss Marple felt the peculiar sadness of knowing that nothing she had said would change official conclusions. The report would remain sealed. The language would stay ambiguous. Elias Verhoeven would remain a mystery on paper. But papers did not define lives. People did. She crossed the square where Anna lived, pausing briefly by the benches. The trees rustled faintly, leaves trembling under the rain's insistence. Waiting, she reflected, was not passive. It was an act of faith performed daily. Miss Marple hoped Anna would continue to wait, not for a return, but for peace. At the station, the familiar hush welcomed her again. Trains arrived and departed, carrying ordinary miracles. She found her seat and watched as the city slipped away, its spires and rooftops dissolving into distance. The Cold War, she thought, was spoken of as though it were a chapter, something with a beginning and an end. In truth, it lingered in habits, in institutions, in the quiet agreements people made with fear. It did not end with treaties. It ended when individuals refused to live divided lives. Elias Verhoeven had refused. Not dramatically, not publicly, but definitively. The train gathered speed. Miss Marple closed her eyes, letting the rhythm steady her thoughts. She imagined Verhoeven somewhere else, waking to a morning that belonged entirely to him.
No codes, no guachis.
Just the gentle requirement of being alive. She wondered if he ever thought of Anna. She believed he did. Love, after all, did not vanish with distance. It merely learned new shapes. When the train slowed near a small town, Miss Marple opened her eyes. For a moment, she considered stepping off, becoming ordinary herself for a day or two. The thought made her smile. "Not yet," she murmured. By the time she reached her destination, the rain had ceased. The sky lifted, revealing a pale, forgiving blue. Miss Marple stepped onto the platform with the calm assurance of someone who had finished listening. The case would never be closed, officially, and that was fitting. Some truths were not meant for resolution, only recognition. As she walked away, Miss Marple carried with her the quiet certainty that Elias Verhoeven had succeeded, not in escaping the Cold War, but in refusing to let it define his soul. The Cold War never ended quietly, but one man had, and in doing so he had reminded the world, if only through absence, that conscience, once awakened, asked for nothing less than freedom. Chapter 11. What Remains Unspoken. Miss Marple returned to her cottage at the edge of the village just as autumn began to loosen its grip. The garden had changed while she was away, leaves settling into corners, roses yielding to quieter colors. She paused at the gate, taking in the familiar stillness. Homecomings, she believed, were a kind of reckoning. One returned not as the same person who had left, but as someone slightly rearranged by understanding. Inside, the cottage welcomed her with patient warmth. She set her bag down, removed her coat, and placed the file on the small table beside the window. For the first time since it had arrived beneath her door, it felt complete. Not solved, complete. That evening, Miss Marple lit a single lamp and sat with her knitting, letting the gentle repetition calm her thoughts. The case of Elias Verhoeven no longer pressed against her mind with urgency. Instead, it lingered like a quiet companion, asking to be acknowledged rather than interrogated. She thought of the people left behind. Anna, with her dignified waiting, the young clerk at the embassy, still carrying a moment of truth in his silence. The waitress, remembering a man who looked relieved when he stood to leave. None of them would ever speak publicly of what they knew. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was precisely how the Cold War had endured, through what remained unspoken. Silence, she murmured, is not emptiness, it is accumulation. A letter arrived the following morning, unmarked and unsigned. Miss Marple recognized the careful script immediately. It was brief. You were right to leave it as it is. Some absences must be respected. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it beside the file. She felt no triumph, only a steady reassurance. The truth had reached those capable of receiving it. That was enough. She walked into the village later that day, exchanging greetings, listening to small concerns. Life resumed its gentle insistence. And yet, beneath the ordinary rhythms, she sensed something familiar. Fear had softened its hold, just slightly. One act of quiet defiance rarely changed the world, but it could change the air around it. As days passed, Miss Marple found herself thinking less about where Verhoeven might be and more about what his choice had preserved. He had left behind no manifesto, no accusations. Only an absence shaped by principle. She imagined him in some modest place, perhaps tending a small garden, learning the patience of growing things. He would not speak of his past. He would not need to. His life now belonged to the present, unburdened by explanation. Miss Marple smiled at the thought. You have learned, she said softly, what so many never do, that freedom is not granted. It is claimed quietly. One afternoon, as the light faded early, Miss Marple reread her notes. The intelligence reports, the interviews, the observations, all of it now formed a single coherent shape. Not a puzzle, but a portrait. The Cold War had trained institutions to value compliance over conscience. Elias Verhoeven had simply refused to comply any longer. And in doing so, he had revealed a flaw no system liked to admit, that it relied on the consent of those within it. Miss Marple closed her notebook, Tomorrow she knew someone else would knock. Another mystery would arrive, soft-footed and uncertain. They always did. But this one had been different. It had asked not what happened, but what must a person do to remain whole. That night, Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the moon rise over the hedges. Somewhere beyond that quiet horizon, borders still existed, and fear still shaped decisions. The Cold War's shadow lingered, long and patient. Yet she felt certain of one thing: not all victories were recorded. Some were lived anonymously, carried forward without witnesses. Miss Marple turned away from the window and extinguished the lamp. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, ordinary, unremarkable, and quietly precious. And in that ordinariness lay the final truth Elias Verhoeven had chosen to protect. Chapter 12. The Quiet Resolution. Miss Marple woke before dawn, the cottage still wrapped in that delicate hush which existed only between night and morning. The air felt newly washed, as though the world itself had decided to begin again without ceremony. She lay still for a moment, listening to the soft ticking of the clock on her mantelpiece. Time, restored to its ordinary purpose, moved without accusation. For the first time since the file had arrived beneath her door, Miss Marple felt no weight pressing upon her thoughts. The story of Elias Verhoeven had reached its natural end, not because every question had been answered, but because the right ones no longer demanded pursuit. She rose quietly and drew the curtains back. Pale light touched the garden, resting briefly on leaves and stone. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Miss Marple brewed her tea slowly, savoring the simple ritual. As the kettle warmed, she reflected on the nature of resolution. People believed it required certainty, proof, declarations. But true resolution, she had learned, arrived when one accepted the shape of truth, even if it could not be displayed. Elias Verhoeven's story would never be told in full. It would remain a collection of silences, understood only by those willing to listen carefully. That, she believed, was exactly how he would have wanted it. She thought of the stopped watch 11:47 no longer as a mystery, but as a kindness, a moment preserved so that the rest of life might continue unmeasured. Later that morning, Miss Marple walked through the village, exchanging nods and gentle words. The postman spoke of weather. A neighbor mentioned her roses. Ordinary conversations unfolded, unremarkable and precious. This, Miss Marple reflected, was what Elias Verhoeven had chosen, the dignity of small days unobserved. At the edge of the green, she paused near a bench and sat for a moment. The memory of distant train stations and silent platforms drifted through her mind, not as longing, but as understanding. "The bravest thing you did," she murmured, "was to become unimportant." She smiled at the thought. Importance was a dangerous burden. Elias had laid it down. In the afternoon, Miss Marple returned home and opened the file one last time. She did not reread the documents. Instead, she removed a single sheet of paper and wrote a brief note in her careful hand. No further action required. She placed it atop the file and closed it gently. Some cases demanded pursuit. Others required restraint. This one had asked for mercy. Miss Marple carried the file to a drawer and placed it there, not locked away, but at rest. It belonged to the past now, where it could do no harm. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not of triumph, but of alignment. The truth had been honored by not being exposed. As evening approached, Miss Marple lit a candle and settled into her chair. Shadows moved softly along the walls, familiar and comforting. She allowed herself to think once more of Anna Verhoeven, still waiting, not for a return, but for peace. Miss Marple believed she would find it in time. The Cold War, for all its grand declarations, had been built on fear and spectacle. But its most profound consequences had been private, lived in kitchens, on train platforms, in moments of moral exhaustion. Elias Verhoeven had stepped out of that long shadow, quietly and decisively. Miss Marple closed her eyes, feeling gratitude rather than sorrow. He had not vanished into nothingness. He had vanished into life. Night settled fully, stars emerging one by one. Miss Marple rose to extinguish the candle, pausing briefly as darkness filled the room. "Sleep well," she said softly, to Elias, to Anna, to herself. Tomorrow would bring another day, another set of ordinary concerns. Somewhere, another mystery would begin its careful approach. But this one had ended exactly as it should have. Not with revelation, not with justice proclaimed, but with understanding. And in that understanding, Miss Marple knew, lay the quiet victory that no war, cold or otherwise, could ever truly defeat.